Hey there, and welcome to exercise number 94. If you want to solve this one on your own, then click on the link in the description. If not, keep watching and we're going to solve it together. In this one, we need to write a function named createObservable that returns an object implementing the observer pattern. Now, if you don't know what the observer pattern is, don't worry about it. I've written a description, a short description here. We have an example below, and I also have a drawing here that I hope will explain it. So let's get into that. What is the observer pattern? Well, this pattern is about one object we're going to call observable that emits some data. For example, this can be a weather station. Then we have one or more objects that are interested in this data we're going to call observers. For example, we can have two people that are interested in the weather data, John Doe and Jane Doe. Now, the observable is going to emit data, so the weather station is going to broadcast out there, hey, the temperature and the humidity is like this. Then after 1 minute, it's going to broadcast again and again and again. And the observers are going to get notified every time new data is emitted, and they will do something about it. So, for example, maybe John Doe is at work, and he gets a notification about some new weather data. It says that it's raining, so it's gonna go and close the window. And I didn't wanna say at work, but at home, right? So you're at home, starts raining, you get the alert on your phone, you're like, okay, let me go close the window. Now, specifically what you do when you get that data doesn't really matter. What matters for this pattern is the interaction between those two types of objects. So objects that emit data, called observables, and objects that listen to the data being emitted, called observers. Now that we went over this diagram, let's go back into the app and read the description. So the object that this function is to return is going to be an observable, right? We can call it like that, and should have the following properties. The first one is called subscribe and is a method used by observers. So remember, in our example, observers are the people. So used by the people to subscribe to the observable. So they will use this method to subscribe, so to get new data, to say, hey, I am interested in new data. When you have it, give it to me. This function, subscribe, is going to accept one parameter, a callback, and this one will be called with the new data when we want to notify the observers. So when we get some new data, we're going to call this callback. The second property on our object is called unsubscribe and is a method used by observers. Again, the observers are the people, to unsubscribe from the observable. So maybe I'm going to sleep, I don't care about the weather data anymore, like in this example, so then I'm gonna unsubscribe. I don't want my phone buzzing with weather data while I'm sleeping. I don't really care. So going back, the unsubscribe method will receive the same callback as the one before. So the callback of the unsubscribe should be the same as the callback for subscribe. And we'll use this callback to unsubscribe the observer, right? And finally, the third parameter is called notify and is a method used to notify observers. So this is what actually triggers. So basically this method is called when we have some new data, and this method in turn will notify all observers, right? This will accept one parameter, data, which can be of any type, and this will be passed as a parameter to the callbacks mentioned before. Now, I know this description might be a bit complicated, so let's look at the example below. I have a simple user class with a name and the weather observable properties that gets a constructor with the name and the weather observable. It assigns the name to it, it assigns the weather observable and subscribes to it, right? So I say, hey, I want to subscribe to some new weather data, and it passes this callback. So this callback is passed to the subscribe function. Then inside of this callback, we're going to get some weather data, and we're going to print this.name, so the name of the user, received weather updates, and then the weather data. The user should also have a property, a method called stop listening that's going to unsubscribe from the weather observable by passing the same callback. So this is how we unsubscribe. We say, hey, I gave you a callback before. Now I want this callback to be like to forget about it. So I'm going to give it to you again. So if you have it stored someplace, just delete it from there, forget about this callback. Now, moving on, we create an observable and we assign it to weather observable, and we create a new user called Bob with the name Bob and the weather observable. And then we call weather observable.notify. So the weather station, you can imagine, gets some new data, and now it notifies all observers. And the data is temperature 20, humidity 80. Well, this data will arrive to our user Bob in this function on weather change, and it will run this code. And what should actually happen is it should print, like it says here, Bob received weather updates and the data. Next, we're going to notify again with a different temperature and different humidity. And again, it says should print Bob received weather updates and so on. Now, after a while, Bob is going to want to stop listening. Let's say Bob goes to sleep. Then the weather station is still going to get new data and it's going to notify all observers. But now because Bob is unsubscribed, so it's not listening anymore, nothing will happen, right? There's not going to be anything printed to the console. So yeah, that's pretty much it regarding the description. I hope this makes sense. So let's move into the right side, into the code area, and start solving the exercise. I want to start by creating an empty object and actually putting the properties that we need to put: subscribe, unsubscribe, and notify. So I'm going to create here const observable, right? And it's going to have a subscribe method, and it's going to have an unsubscribe, and it's going to have one called notify. Good. Now the subscribe method is going to get a callback, so let's put it here. The unsubscribe is going to get a callback, and notify is going to get some data. Now the subscribe method actually needs to add this callback someplace, right? We need to know that this callback has been subscribed. So then in notify, we can go over the callback and, call it because it's a function. So I'm going to create here a variable called, let's call it observers, and it's going to be an empty array. And when I get a callback, I'm just going to push it there. This dot it's not this because we're not in a class. Observers dot push callback. If we leave the code like this, this means that you can subscribe multiple times with the same callback. And I don't really want that because, each callback should only be able to subscribe once with it. So I'm just going to do a check here. If observers.includes callback. So if it doesn't include, let's put a not before, then I'm going to push it. Now that we wrote this, it's pretty simple to do the notify function, because in order to notify all observers, I'm just going to go for each one of them, observers.forEach, and we have a callback. And I'm just going to call callback with this data, exactly like it says here. Any data should be passed as parameter to the observers callback functions. And finally, to unsubscribe this callback, all I have to do is remove it from this array. So let's find its index. I can say index of is observers.index of callback. And I'm going to say observers.splice. I think this one removes it. Yeah. Index of n1. So I just want to remove that element from the array. And finally, also, don't forget to return observable. And to be honest, this is pretty much it, right? So we have the subscribe, unsubscribe, notify. Let's test our code. So I'm just gonna get the data from here. Let's put it here and let's look in the console. So we get two console logs, right? Temperature 20, humidity 80, temperature 25, humidity 75. And then this last one with temperature 22 and humidity 68, is not being called on our Bob user because he has stopped listening to the observable. Now, let's say we create another user. So let's say Bob and Joe. New user, Joe, and has the same weather observable. Now we should get 5, which is correct because Joe doesn't unsubscribe. So we get this data twice for Bob and for Joe. You can see here Bob received, Joe received. Then we get this data twice for Bob and Joe. And the last data, we only get it for Joe because Bob has stopped listening. This looks good. Now let's test our solution and voila, it works. Cheers and see you in the next one.